In the long night of the Antarctic winter, a photographer's flash illuminates a haunting sight. The year is 1915, and a British ship, the Endurance, is trapped in a vast sea of ice. The rare photographic images record for the ages an extraordinary true-life drama. 28 men stranded at the end of the earth, beyond all hope of rescue. The story of these men and their leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton, is a saga of heroism and human endurance that will forever be regarded as one of the greatest adventures of all time. Surrounded by immense ice floes, gripped by perpetual cold, no place on Earth is more hostile to life than Antarctica. As forbidding as a distant planet, it was the last continent reached by explorers. For some, like Ernest Shackleton, this frozen realm at the bottom of the world became an obsession.
I felt strangely drawn to the mysterious south. I vowed to myself that someday I would go to the region of ice and snow and go on till I came to one of the poles of the earth, the end of the axis upon which this great round ball turns.
Shackleton attempted to reach the South Pole twice, only to have it claimed first by others. He set his sights on a new dream: to be the first explorer to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. But exploration here was unlike anywhere else. The early explorers encountered winds of nearly 100 miles per hour and temperatures that plummeted to minus 70 degrees. Yet they also discovered a place of wild, unearthly beauty. For Shackleton and others who ventured south, the gateway to the Antarctic was a remote island of rock and ice called South Georgia. Whaling stations here were the last outposts of civilization. In November 1914, the Endurance sat at anchor taking on final provisions, her crew eager to make history. Born in Ireland, already a British national hero, Ernest Shackleton was a man of towering ambition and boundless optimism. He saw his expedition as the last great polar journey of the heroic age of exploration. By dog sled, he would travel 1,500 miles across the continent. But to reach the starting point at Vassal Bay, he would have to navigate the uncharted waters of the Weddell Sea. The trip would be documented using both still and motion picture cameras by Australian Frank Hurley, who would go to any extreme to get a shot. Shackleton handpicked most of his crew in England, including trusted friend Frank Wild and the ship's captain, Frank Worsley. He is said to have posted an unusual recruitment notice. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, safe return, doubtful. 5,000 volunteered, but in all, it was a company of just 27 scientists, officers, and seamen. But the men were not the only passengers aboard the Endurance. With them were nearly 70 Canadian sled dogs, uneasy at sea and in constant need of attention. Despite warnings from the whalers that ice conditions were the worst in memory, they set out from South Georgia on December 5th, 1914. As land receded, they lost all contact with the outside world. Only 2 days later, they encountered ominous signs. Unexpected patches of sea ice and enormous icebergs. Soon, an increasingly dense jigsaw puzzle of ice floes slowed the ship. But the Endurance, named from Shackleton's family motto, "By endurance we conquer," was one of the strongest wooden ships of the day, with a bow 4 feet thick. Photographer Hurley wrote in his diary,
"All day we have been utilising the ship as a battering ram. We admire our sturdy little ship, which seems to take a delight herself in shattering the floes in grand style."
For 6 weeks, the Endurance battled the ice, dodging floes or smashing through them. There was little concern among the men. Shackleton had their unshakable confidence. To them, he was the boss. But as they headed deeper into the Weddell Sea, ice compressed around the ship. To save fuel, Shackleton stopped the engines. When the temperature dropped sharply, it sealed their fate. The Endurance was frozen solid in a sea of ice. The ship's carpenter, Chippy McNeish.
We tried to cut away the ice, but it was no use. That would not give us much chance of ever getting away.
They were trapped, alone, with no means to contact the outside world for help. The ship's doctor, Alexander Macklin.
Shackleton showed one of his sparks of real greatness. He did not show the slightest sign of disappointment. He told us simply and calmly that we must winter in the pack.
When the ice broke up in spring, they would sail on. As Hurley recorded, life took on an almost pleasant routine. Like schoolboys, they occupied themselves with games. To sustain morale, Shackleton kept everyone busy and everyone equal. Well supplied for their Antarctic crossing, they had sufficient food and warm clothing. He had the carpenter McNeish build comfortable living quarters they called the Ritz, where nightly amusements included sing-alongs and toasts to loved ones back home. Succumbing to winter madness, the men all shaved their heads and posed for Hurley. The sled dogs became their companions and a source of unending entertainment. They took well to the snow and slept in ice caves and so-called dogloos. Shackleton inspired a sense of camaraderie. He conveyed to his men, strength lies in unity. Unity that was about to be tested by catastrophe. As spring approached and the ice continued to move, it did not free the Endurance, but instead began to crush her. Photographer Hurley.
The ship shrieks and quivers. Windows splinter. Deck timbers gape and twist.
Shackleton confided to Worsley.
The ship can't live in this, Skipper. It's only a matter of time. What the ice gets, the ice keeps.
Shackleton realized the Endurance was going down. He gave the order, abandon ship. They salvaged what was vital, leaving behind their most precious belongings.
We had learned to love her, and it was awful to witness her torture.
The ship that had been their home and hope for 326 days was now gone. It was their darkest moment. They were now forced to camp on the ice.
As always with him, what had happened had happened. Now this was in the past, and he looked to the future.
His dream now dashed, Shackleton set a new goal: to save every life. Twice they made exhausting efforts to march to safety, hauling the lifeboats, but the ice proved impassable. They could only hope that the ice floe beneath them would drift closer to land. They called their new home Patience Camp because all they could do was wait. Captain Worsley.
All we seem to think of now is food. We're ready to eat anything, especially cooked blubber.
Days turned to months. Food was rationed. First Officer Lionel Greenstreet.
The food now is pretty well all meat. Seal steaks, stewed seal, penguin steaks, penguin liver, the latter being very good indeed.
Shackleton's every waking hour was devoted to holding his men together. As the story goes, when Greenstreet spilled his cup of milk, nearly weeping, the others silently refilled it from their own. To prompt much-needed laughter, Shackleton and Worsley danced. Officer Thomas Ordelise.
That's Sir Ernest all over. His unfailing cheeriness means a lot to a band of disappointed explorers like ourselves. He's one of the greatest optimists living.
But the men were growing weary. Their clothes always wet. Their hunger never satisfied. McNeish.
I'm sitting in my bag reading this, and my hands are just about frostbitten. It is hard lying down every night, cold and hungry.
After 5 long months on a drifting ice floe, a curious motion was detected, the swell of the ocean beneath them. The ice was breaking up. Soon it would be possible to launch the lifeboats and set out for land. Captain Worsley calculated they had drifted 600 miles toward the Antarctic Peninsula and islands at its tip. They hoped to reach supplies stored at Paulet Island. Their last possible landfall was Elephant Island. Shackleton faced a life and death decision. If they left too soon, they could be crushed by ice. Too late, swept hopelessly out to sea. Finally, the time was right. Seaman William Bakewell.
Our first day in the water was one of the coldest and most dangerous of the expedition. The ice was running riot. It was a hard race to keep our boats in the open leads. We had many narrow escapes from being crushed, and the larger masses of the pack would come together.
The men had been trapped on ice for 15 months. But their real struggle was just beginning. Captain Worsley.
The northwest wind turned the snow to sleet and rain, which froze on men and stores, making us wet, cold, and miserable.
Their clothes became icy armor. Their hands froze to the oars. In the gathering dusk of the first night at sea, Shackleton ordered his men onto a small floe. The meager comforts of this floating camp would prove the last of their voyage. Among floes too small for a camp, they were now confined to the crowded boats day and night. Shivering in icy water, the men tried to snatch minutes of sleep. The long-awaited escape had become an ordeal of hardship and suffering. On the fourth day, under hazy sunshine, Worsley balanced against the mast and took the first navigational sight the weather had allowed. Not a single mile had been gained. Instead, the currents had carried them backwards 30 miles.
Most of the men were now looking seriously worn and strained. Their lips were cracked, and their eyes showed red in their salt-encrusted faces. Obviously, we must make land quickly, and I decided to run for Elephant Island.
Shackleton was now racing for the very lives of his men. At dawn on the sixth day, the sleepless men at last beheld a glorious sight. Ahead, they could see the harsh glaciers and icy mountains of Elephant Island. But as they approached the rocky coast, they encountered a tidal current so strong they could make no headway. There would be no landfall after all, but another night in the pitching boats. Shackleton, who had barely slept since leaving Patience Camp, would call it a stern night. When the seas finally calmed, they rowed along miles of coastline, searching for a safe refuge. They sighted a narrow beach of surf-beaten rocks.
2 days and nights without drink or hot food had played havoc with most of the men. I decided that we must face the hazards of this unattractive landing place.
They had spent 7 fearful days on the open sea, 170 days drifting on a floe of ice, and 497 days since last setting foot on land. But this remote island offered no hope of rescue. Shackleton decided on a desperate gamble. He ordered McNeish to strengthen the largest lifeboat and add a sheltering deck. Skillfully, the carpenter prepared the battered boat for a long voyage. Shackleton would try the impossible, an 800-mile sail in a lifeboat across the roughest seas on Earth, back to the whaling stations of South Georgia, the only direction permitted by winds and currents. In the 22-foot lifeboat named the James Caird, Shackleton and 5 others set out, leaving his friend Frank Wild in charge with a letter.
In the event of my not surviving the boat journey to South Georgia, you will do your best for the rescue of the party. Convey my love to my people, and say I tried my best.
The Caird set out on a day of rare sunshine that made the waters sparkle and dance. Mocking the impossible odds, Shackleton joked with Worsley.
I know nothing about boat sailing.
That's all right, boss. I do. This is my 3rd boat journey. The routine was 3 men on deck and 3 men in bags deluding themselves that they were sleeping.
Going below the canvas decking was a dreaded ordeal. The waterlogged space was only 5 by 7 feet. On the 3rd day, Worsley got his first glimpse of the sun to fix their position. Overcast skies and heaving seas made it almost impossible to use his sextant to navigate. Yet, if Worsley were off by even half a degree, they could miss South Georgia altogether and disappear in the open ocean. The seas began to rise. Winds blew into gales.
We were getting soaked on an average every 3 or 4 minutes. This went on day and night. The cold was intense. Whenever Shackleton noticed that a man seemed extra cold and shivered, he would immediately order another hot drink, served to all.
Back on Elephant Island, Frank Wilde and 21 others faced a different sort of agony, waiting and wondering. They had little protection from the wind and cold, and little source of food but penguins and seals. And they lived daily with the knowledge that no one would look for them here if Shackleton failed to make it. Still, they believed that if anyone could save them, it was the boss. When the sun appeared, amid great cumulus clouds on the 10th day, a spell of fair weather sped the Caird onward. But drinking water was running low. The men were tortured by thirst. Worse, they began to fear they could miss South Georgia. The boat had been damaged by the gales and was leaking badly. Yet, a promising sign appeared. Then, on the 15th day, they sighted land. Across 800 miles of storm-tossed seas, Worsley had somehow found South Georgia.
We looked at each other with cheerful, foolish grins. The thoughts uppermost were, we've done it.
But a rising gale made landing too dangerous.
Our need of water and rest was well nigh desperate. There was nothing for it but to haul off till the following morning.
During the night, nature played a cruel trick. Not merely a gale, but a full-force hurricane. Shackleton feared the end was at hand. But when the morning dawned, miraculously, the wind had died, and they headed for shore. In the years to come, their voyage in the Caird would be judged one of the greatest open boat journeys ever accomplished. "17 days after leaving Elephant Island, they spotted a small, sheltered cove.
In a minute or two, we were inside. And in the gathering darkness, the James Caird ran in on its swell and touched the beach. It was a splendid moment.
But their boat was too damaged to go further. And the nearest whaling station was on the opposite coast across treacherous glaciers and mountains. Shackleton had no choice but to attempt crossing the uncharted interior on foot. With wood screws from the lifeboat fastened to their boot soles, wearing threadbare clothing, Shackleton, Worsley, and Second Officer Tom Crean set out on a non-stop march across South Georgia. They carried just 3 days' provisions, 2 compasses, a rope, and a carpenter's adze to be used as an ice axe. They had no idea what perils lay ahead. No one had ever made this crossing of nearly 30 miles over rugged crevasses and peaks. With the end of the first day approaching, they found themselves facing a long and steep descent from a high pass. They could not stop for fear of freezing at that altitude. Shackleton remained silent for some minutes, thinking.
I don't like our position at all. Got to take a risk. Are you game? We'll slide.
We seemed to shoot into space. For a moment, my hair fairly stood on end. Then, quite suddenly, I felt a glow. I was actually enjoying it.
In only a few minutes, they had descended almost 2,000 feet. On the second morning, after 27 hours of climbing, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean struggled up a steep slope. They believed that across a range of mountains to the east were the whaling stations of Stromness Bay. If they were right, a work whistle would sound at 7 o'clock.
In intense excitement, we watched the chronometer. Right to the minute, the steam whistle came to us, borne clearly on the wind.
It was the first sound heard from the outside world in 17 months. Nearly a century later, on South Georgia, at the same landfall made by Shackleton in the James Caird, a ship arrives carrying 3 of today's most accomplished mountaineers. Stephen Venables, Conrad Anker, and Reinhold Messner, who himself achieved Shackleton's dream of the first Antarctic crossing on foot. These world-class climbers will retrace Shackleton's route across the island to see what he faced. All share the same motivation. Ernest Shackleton has long been their hero. Stephen Venables.
I just hadn't realized the sheer scale of it. They covered so much ground, such complicated ground. We had to go carefully, slowly, wearing crampons, these special claws on our feet, which they didn't have.
These climbers have scaled some of the highest peaks in the world, yet South Georgia proves a more difficult challenge than expected. Conrad Anker.
Initially I thought, well, it couldn't be that hard. They did it in 1916, and they did it with leather boots and an old rope. But we encountered a complete maze of ice towers and crevasses running in all different directions.
Reinhold Messner.
When Shackleton and his men did it, snow bridges covered these crevasses, but they could have fallen through at any time. They were in a totally unknown world. They didn't know what to expect.
You could really imagine their euphoria when they looked down and saw they were going to make it. They got through by ingenuity and sheer determination. We did the crossing in 3 days as fit, well-fed climbers, and it was hard work. They did it in 36 hours without rest, their feet still numb from the boat's journey.
Given the condition they were in and the difficulty of the climb, it's phenomenal they were able to do it at all. There aren't many stories of human endurance that compare to this one.
Shackleton converted his disappointment into an incredible odyssey of survival and turned failure into triumph.
As the story goes, Shackleton and his men were led by an old Norwegian whaler to the station manager's home, their faces gray with blubber smoke, hair matted with salt. "Who are you?" asked the manager. The man said quietly, "My name is Shackleton." The manager turned away and wept. The worst was finally over for Shackleton, but his every thought was with the men he left behind. After rescuing the others on South Georgia, Shackleton made 3 attempts to reach the men on Elephant Island, but the ice blocked his path for 4 long months. For Wild and his men, all hope was fading. They began to think the unthinkable. Shackleton had been lost at sea. Then, on August 30th, 1916, they sighted a ship headed toward them. When a boat was within hearing distance, they called out in unison, Shackleton anxiously counted the figures on the beach. He turned to Worsley. "They're all there, Skipper. They're all safe." Not a single life had been lost. The story of Shackleton and his men is an epic of the human spirit, of 27 men driven bravely by the will to live, of one leader determined heroically to save them all, no matter what. Shackleton would later write,
"In memories we were rich. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the soul of man.